Last night, on May 15th, 2026, at 9 p.m., news just broke that is so devastating, so strategically significant, and so completely at odds with the official narrative that the Israeli government and the American media have been pushing for the past 6 months, that I need you to stop whatever you are doing and understand exactly what just happened, what it means, and why the next 48 hours are going to determine whether this conflict remains a regional war or become something far larger and far more catastrophic. 1 hour ago, confirmation came through from multiple independent military sources, from battlefield correspondents operating inside Gaza and southern Lebanon, and from intercepted communications that have been verified by 3 separate intelligence services, that 364 Israeli soldiers have been killed in a coordinated ambush. 364, in a single engagement, in a single operational theater, in what military analysts are already calling the most catastrophic single-day loss of Israeli military personnel since the Yom Kippur War of 1973. And the Israeli government has not yet made a public statement. The Israel Defense Forces spokesperson has not held a briefing. The Prime Minister's office is dark. And that silence, that institutional silence in the face of a loss of this magnitude, tells you everything you need to know about how completely this ambush has shattered the operational assumptions that Israeli military planning has been built on. Now, here's what makes this so incredibly significant. For the past 6 months, the Israeli government has been telling its citizens and the world that the military campaign in Gaza and southern Lebanon is proceeding according to plan, that Hamas and Hezbollah have been degraded to the point where large-scale organized military operations are no longer possible, that the threat of coordinated, sophisticated ambushes against Israeli ground forces has been effectively neutralized by months of intelligence collection, aerial bombardment, and ground operations, that the hard work has been done and that what remains is a mopping-up operation, not a war. 364 soldiers killed in a single ambush have just proven that narrative to be catastrophically false. And the implications of that, not just militarily, but politically, diplomatically, and strategically, are going to unfold with a speed and a force that the Israeli government, the American administration, and the entire Western alliance are completely unprepared for. Let me explain what actually happened, because the details of this ambush reveal a level of military sophistication, a depth of operational planning, and a degree of intelligence penetration of Israeli military movements that should terrify every analyst who has been assuming that Hamas and Hezbollah have been effectively degraded. The ambush was executed in 3 simultaneous phases across 2 operational theaters. That simultaneity is the first indicator of the level of coordination involved. This was not a reactive engagement where fighters encountered an Israeli patrol and attacked. This was a planned, rehearsed, pre-positioned operation that was triggered at a specific moment against specific units whose movements had clearly been tracked and anticipated. Phase 1 occurred in the northern Gaza corridor in the area around Jabalia, where Israeli forces have been conducting what the IDF described as a final clearance operation for the past 3 weeks. 3 Israeli armored columns, each consisting of Merkava tanks, armored personnel carriers, and infantry in support, were moving through what had been assessed as a cleared urban environment. The assessment was wrong. The ambush was triggered simultaneously against all 3 columns. Anti-tank missiles, including what appear to be Iranian-supplied Kornet systems and a newer generation of missiles that Israeli intelligence had not confirmed as being in the inventory of Gaza-based forces, were fired from prepared positions embedded in underground infrastructure that had survived months of Israeli bombardment. Simultaneously, tunnel openings that had been undetected by Israeli engineering units produced fighters directly behind the armored columns, cutting off withdrawal routes. And drone-dropped munitions, small precision devices that targeted the top armor of Merkava tanks where it is thinnest, engaged vehicles that had already been immobilized by the anti-tank missiles. The 3-dimensional nature of that attack, missiles from prepared positions, fighters from tunnels behind the columns, drones from above, is not the operational signature of a degraded, desperate, poorly equipped fighting force. It is the signature of a military organization that has spent months preparing a specific trap for a specific type of Israeli operation in a specific location, and it worked. Phase 2 occurred simultaneously in southern Lebanon in the area east of Tyre where Israeli forces have been maintaining a buffer zone. A Hezbollah operation that Israeli surveillance had assessed as logistical movement of fighters between positions turned out to be the final positioning of an ambush force that had been moving into place over 4 days in small groups specifically to avoid triggering Israeli surveillance thresholds. When the Hezbollah ambush triggered simultaneously with the Gaza operation, Israeli command had to make decisions about resource allocation with both theaters in crisis at the same moment. Reinforcements that would have gone to Gaza were diverted toward Lebanon. Medical evacuation helicopters that were needed in Gaza were redirected. Air support that was engaged in Gaza had to split its attention. The simultaneity was not coincidental. It was designed to create exactly that resource allocation crisis. Phase 3 was a coordinated electronic warfare operation that began 30 seconds before the physical ambush in both locations. It jammed Israeli tactical communications on frequencies that had been standard operational frequencies for Israeli ground forces in Gaza for months. The fact that Hamas and Hezbollah knew which specific frequencies Israeli units were using means that operational communication security had been compromised. Israeli commanders in the middle of the ambush found themselves unable to communicate with adjacent units or with command elements for critical minutes at the most dangerous moment of the engagement. 30 seconds of communications jamming at the moment an ambush is triggered. Three-dimensional simultaneous attacks in Gaza. Coordinated simultaneous engagement in Lebanon. Resource allocation crisis created by simultaneity. These are not the tactics of a degraded adversary. These are the tactics of a military organization that has been studying Israeli operational patterns for months, identifying vulnerabilities, preparing infrastructure, positioning forces, and waiting for the right moment. The right moment came tonight on May 16, 2026. Now here is where it gets really interesting. Let me walk you through what the 3 and 64 number actually means, because the scale of this loss needs to be contextualized to be fully understood. Israel is a country of approximately 10 million people. Its military is built on universal conscription, reserve service, and a citizen army model where virtually every family has a member in uniform or recently out of uniform. The military is not an abstraction for Israeli society. It is personal, immediate, and deeply embedded in national identity. The largest single-day loss in Israel's modern military history before tonight was during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when Israeli forces suffered devastating losses in the first days of the war before mobilization could fully respond to the Egyptian and Syrian surprise attacks. The psychological impact of those losses on Israeli society shaped national security policy for decades. The trauma of that moment drove an entire generation of Israeli strategic thinking. 364 soldiers killed in a single ambush tonight is a loss of that order of magnitude, not in the context of an existential surprise attack from multiple state adversaries. In the context of a campaign that the government has been describing as proceeding successfully. In the context of an adversary that the public has been told is degraded, desperate, and near defeat. The political impact of that gap between the official narrative and the reality of tonight is going to be enormous. The Israeli public has been told one thing for 6 months. Tonight, the reality of what is actually happening in Gaza and Lebanon has broken through in the most brutal, undeniable way possible. And governments that have told their publics one thing and delivered another do not survive that kind of rupture without significant political consequences. Prime Minister Netanyahu's position was already fragile before tonight. Coalition tensions, hostage deal negotiations, pressure from the international community, war crimes investigations at the International Criminal Court, all of it was already creating political stress that his government was struggling to manage. Tonight's ambush has not just added to that stress. It has potentially broken the political architecture that was holding his coalition together. Within the next 24 hours, Israeli citizens are going to start learning the names of the 364 soldiers who were killed, not as a statistic, as neighbors, as family members, as people they went to school with, as children of people they know. The abstract number is going to become 364 individual human stories of loss. And the question those 364 families are going to be asking, and that Israeli society is going to be asking with them, is why? Why were they in a position where this ambush was possible? Why did intelligence fail to detect the preparation? Why were the lessons of months of fighting not sufficient to prevent this? Who is responsible? Those questions are going to drive Israeli politics for months, and the answers are not going to be comfortable for the current government. Now let me focus for a minute on the international dimensions of tonight, because the ambush does not exist in a geopolitical vacuum, and the reactions from key players in the next 24 hours are going to shape what happens next. Iran's role in tonight's operation is not yet fully confirmed, but is strongly implied by the weapon systems used. The newer generation anti-tank missiles that appeared in the Gaza phase of the ambush, missiles that Israeli intelligence had not confirmed as being in Hamas's inventory, are consistent with Iranian weapons development programs and with Iranian supply routes that have been operating through Sudan, through Libya, through maritime smuggling channels that Israeli interdiction efforts have been unable to fully close. If Iran's fingerprints are confirmed on tonight's operation, the pressure on the Israeli government to respond against Iranian territory directly is going to be enormous. And a direct Israeli strike on Iranian territory in the current environment, with the Strait of Hormuz already destabilized, with Turkey's corridor just operationalized but not yet at full capacity, with global energy markets already volatile, risks a regional escalation that no one has a containment plan for. The United States government tonight faces a genuinely terrible set of options. If Washington publicly supports Israel's right to respond to tonight's ambush without qualification, it is endorsing whatever response the Israeli government chooses, including potentially strikes on Iranian territory that could trigger a regional war. If Washington calls for restraint and de-escalation, it is seen as abandoning an ally in its moment of greatest crisis in years. If Washington tries to thread the needle with carefully worded statements, it satisfies nobody and signals weakness to everyone. There is no good option. And the Biden playbook that managed similar crises through private pressure and public support is not available to the current administration because the relationship dynamics and the political constraints are completely different. The Arab states in the Gulf are watching tonight's events with complicated reactions. On one hand, they have no sympathy for Hamas or Hezbollah. On the other hand, 364 Israeli soldiers killed in a single engagement demonstrates that the military campaign has not achieved the decisive results that Israel claimed, and a prolonged, destabilizing conflict on their doorstep is bad for Gulf economic development plans, bad for the normalization processes that Saudi Arabia and others have been pursuing, and bad for the investment climate that Gulf states are trying to build. Riyadh is going to be very quiet tonight, publicly. Privately, Saudi officials are going to be having urgent conversations about what tonight means for the regional security architecture and whether the assumptions that normalization planning was built on need to be revised. Let me talk for a minute about what tonight means for the hostage situation, because there are still Israeli and foreign nationals being held in Gaza, and the impact of tonight's ambush on any negotiation for their release is significant, and it is not positive. The ambush demonstrates that Hamas retains significant military capability and significant organizational coherence after months of Israeli military pressure. That changes the negotiating dynamic. A Hamas that is militarily desperate is a Hamas that needs a deal. A Hamas that just successfully executed a 364 casualty ambush against one of the most technologically sophisticated militaries in the world is a Hamas that believes it still has options. From Hamas's perspective tonight, the leverage for any hostage negotiation just increased. Because the military pressure that Israel was applying to force Hamas toward a deal has just been shown to be insufficient to break Hamas's military capability. And when the pressure is insufficient, the entity being pressured has less incentive to make concessions. For the families of the hostages, tonight is a nightmare within a nightmare. The ambush makes a negotiated deal harder to reach because it strengthens Hamas's negotiating position. But a military escalation in response to the ambush, which is the political pressure the Israeli government is now going to face, makes a negotiated deal even harder because escalation and negotiation are incompatible. If you are watching this tonight from Israel, you need to understand that what happened 1 hour ago is not just a military setback. It is a moment that is going to force a fundamental reassessment of every assumption that has been driving this campaign. The assumption that 6 months of military pressure has degraded Hamas and Hezbollah to the point where organized large-scale operations are no longer possible has been proven wrong. The assumption that Israeli intelligence has sufficient visibility into enemy preparations has been proven wrong. The assumption that the current operational approach is moving toward a definable end state has been thrown into serious question. Those are not comfortable things to confront, but they need to be confronted. Because the alternative, continuing with the same approach based on the same flawed assumptions, is what produces another ambush. If you are watching this tonight from outside the region, you need to understand that what happened 1 hour ago has the potential to reshape the entire Middle East conflict in ways that will ripple through global energy markets, global security architecture, and global politics for years. Here is the bottom line. Tonight, on May 16, 2026, at 9 p.m., confirmation emerged that 364 Israeli soldiers have been killed in a coordinated three-phase ambush executed simultaneously in Gaza and southern Lebanon, representing the single largest loss of Israeli military personnel in a single engagement since the Yom Kippur War of 1973. The ambush demonstrated military sophistication, intelligence penetration of Israeli operational movements, and coordination across two theaters that completely contradicts the official Israeli government narrative of a campaign proceeding successfully against a degraded adversary. The weapon systems used indicate Iranian involvement at a level that Israeli intelligence had not fully mapped, raising the possibility of direct Israeli retaliation against Iranian territory with all the escalatory risks that entails. The political consequences for the Netanyahu government are potentially existential, as 364 families begin to receive notification and Israeli society confronts the gap between 6 months of official optimism and tonight's catastrophic reality. The hostage negotiation dynamic has shifted against a quick resolution as Hamas's demonstrated military capability reduces its incentive to make concessions. The United States faces a genuinely terrible set of options with no good choices available and significant consequences attached to every path. And the next 48 hours are going to determine whether this remains a terrible but contained moment in an ongoing conflict or becomes the trigger for a regional escalation that nobody has a plan to manage. 364 soldiers. One ambush, 1 hour ago. And almost nothing in the American media coverage tonight is capturing the full weight of what just happened.